Yeah, no, just a question. So when you actually do the testing, you always do it in your head. What could go wrong? You don't ask some kind of focus group.
So when I do things in my head, it involves other heads that I collaborate with a lot. I'm a big fan of this strong style pair programming. I try to convince my other testers and pretty much anyone at the office who wants to pair with me. I can force the 15-year-old because he has no options. But you know, the adults who have been there longer, they sometimes pair with me. So I can go and ask anyone, anything is allowed. And I do this thing called mob programming or mob testing a lot as well, where we use one computer, we have a group of 10 people working on the one problem. And in those groups in particular, I would have business people involved in creation of the code as well. And the finding problems in half a sentence, it's a really powerful thing to do. So definitely, even though it happens in my head, it's more like it's controlled from my head, and it's controlled from everyone else's head, but we do need to talk. This is a world where no one can do pretty much anything nowadays, all by themselves anymore.
We have biases.
Yeah, I have biases, and that's why I actively seek people who have different biases. I'm actually, that's one of the things that I'm very into researching. What are the biases? How can I work with them? And how can I counteract them?
And that was my question. Like, how don't you fall in the risk of creating biases when you like ask the tester or your team, like you as you said, scoping actively different?
Mm-hmm.
And because I am afraid that like when you develop some app which is targeted to one user at a time in the end, but in the testing you start telling them think this, think that, but that's not what you want. In the end you want him to think as natural as possible. You see what I mean? Like the end user will not have someone telling him think actively different.
No,
So
what I think of it in this is like, sure, there are biases. We can decide not to react on some of the feedback we find in the biased way. But also, I kind of think of it as fast forwarding a year in production. Like I used to work in an insurance company. There are things that happen on 1 week around change of the year that we often have to test sometime in summer. It's not realistic, but we can't schedule all that stuff to happen exactly that time. And we usually test for like 2 to 4 weeks time frame. 30 days is the contractual time frame to test. And you still have to fit the whole year, all the relevant aspects from the whole fiscal year into that testing. So it's kind of like fast forwarding the whole things that could happen. And some of the things that you talk about as biases, I would call them as kind of like, there's the basic use of a user that you want to imagine like a scenario or persona of
user
what they would do. But that user also has the, I'm a bit nervous today, I'm clicking like crazy persona. And we're just packing all of that up together, but we also, as testers at least I feel, we need to be learning to talk about where these kind of like personas and ideas come from. For newbies, a lot of times they come from like, I was told that this is how I make it crash. But there's actually a story behind every one of those crashes on why do we do that and what kind of like an assumption of error or user behavior it's connected to. And I don't claim I can talk about all of that, but I'm practicing that like crazy.
One more. How can you avoid running into over-testing? Like that then the thing becomes slow, you become counterproductive with that. So when do you feel that?
Question is, how do I avoid over-testing? Usually by regularly reflecting on what kind of results we're providing, but are we finding information when we're testing? And again, there's so many different kinds of testing. Like developers themselves, when they code something, they test a lot themselves. Sometimes, it goes to production based on that. Like I don't need to look at it at all. So all of this is it's like discussions, and when you fail, you get the feedback of missing something, and then you again have that discussion. But for the last, 6 years, 7 years, I worked in projects that deliver either bi-weekly or daily basis. So my I remember the old world where we released in the end of the project, so I know that it exists. But I'm so happy I've been part of organizations that have changed that into the continuous delivery, where you can take the feedback every day, and even if you test it too much, when you learn, you can fix that. Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, if you have any tips for startups that maybe have limited programmers and they're already full of work, so how much testing to do in that case? And how much effort to put into fixing or identifying these type of bugs?
Tips for startups, I think this is all very risk-based. How much effort do you put in developing it in the startups? It's exactly the same way of thinking about around the testing. And a lot of times in the startups, the ability to move fast so that you would have automation that kind of keeps you on track later on might be the more relevant thing than the thing that you do first. But all of this, it's so much connected to the skills of everyone who's working there, not just testers, not just programmers, but everyone who's working there. And there's so many developers who don't know how to do TDD, for example. And when in startup, they might not take the time to learn, even though that might be the critical thing that they would be, needing to learn. So there's so many mixes on how you could put these things together. Usually what I see with startups is that at some point they have customer segments that start to feel strongly about wasting their time with bad bugs or bad problems. And then they find a way of organizing. Some of them I see making developers test more, some of them I see as hiring their first tester. But it's like there's no easy answer. It depends on the risk. If your customers tell you that they want to work with you because you're too buggy, then you're not testing enough. But again, when you're scaling up in a startup and you end up from the kind of the finding your idea and fine-tuning what it is into trying to monetize it, if you haven't set up your testing by that time, then you will probably need to invest in it. Otherwise, the scaling will be somewhat of a difficult. But even in bigger companies, I recognize that there's always too much to do. It's not a startup problem, it's everywhere problem. Tarmo.
Hey, Maren. You mentioned communities and skill sets. Where, online or offline, where can people find other people, learn from them, discuss where are the testers in the world?
So I started facilitating a Finnish software testing group, like a non-profit thing, and we have regular meetups, so that I would find the people that I couldn't find 12 years ago, and everyone is welcome to join that. So there's a meetup group called Helsinki Agile Testing, so please join that one.
Agile?
Helsinki Agile Testing. So that's where I organize meetings of people. There's other meetup groups on various topics. I warmly recommend going to those. Just, go and meet like-minded people. But I nowadays find people who are better than me by going to Twitter and saying, I have 2 hours to pair test, would anyone be up for it? And I usually get somebody to say hey, let's work together. So the craftsmanship community is very much global nowadays. And with Skype and the other online tools, you can do online shared testing in the StrongStart very easily. So I use a tool called Screen Hero to accomplish that. Other questions?
So you're basically testing a complex system in the sense there are many elements connected and everything could go wrong.
Yes.
What could you say about testing an app? Is there some difference?
Testing an app?
Yeah, digital app.
The apps are also as much complex systems and connected. It's a different way of connection. So what I'm testing right now is applications on a Windows platform. Sometimes I'm testing applications that connect to other applications to do very complicated calculation things. I've tested all kinds of apps, but the system is actually, the most complicated part of systems is the person, people. Like the user base and the delivery mechanisms of how people get that to their use. So it's still like it's just backtracking what kind of things need to be covered. Like I might like for example, if I compare F-Secure 10 years ago and Ilmarinen, where I went after that, F-Secure had I think then like 20-something different product versions, more than 20-something product versions out that needed to be supported. It made a lot of complications. Ilmarinen had only one production environment, very much simpler. But Ilmarinen then had these like interfaces between different applications and systems, like crazy. So there's always complexity. It's just in a different place.
And you mean by people that the most difficult part is when people interact with that, not
So when I talk about people, I mean both all stakeholders. The people who use the app, they are very, they do complicated things. The environments in which those people use the app, but also the development group that creates that app. That's a very complicated system as well.
So, is it so that you test?
Can you repeat this?
Is it so that you test mostly applications which have user interface? But what about applications which
Is
work
that-
somewhere on a server in the background?
That is a great question. Thank you for that. No, I don't test mostly applications that have a user interface. I demo mostly applications that have a user interface because in 10 to 15 minutes you won't get a grasp of something that is an API-based thing. I test on the level of any API, especially in the world of REST services. There's increasingly more testing happening around, like, write text here, send it, and see what comes back. So I do a lot of that. And I don't, like from my perspective, the better unit testers also have an exploratory mindset on growing their unit tests and understanding what they're missing. And a lot of times, when I test with a developer, they show me their unit tests. The discussions that we have when we pair end up with more unit tests. So the exploratory mindset isn't bound to the user interface, but that usually is a place where it's easy to start, and it takes a little less time for kind of getting the grasp of what we're doing. Other questions? Marco.
Do you do retrospectives of your own work? I mean, do you contact support, for example, that you tell me nice bugs that I should be aware of and learn from?
So he's asking, do I do retrospectives? How do I get information about the bugs, or how should he get information about the bugs that he should learn from? I tend to build a lot of relationships with people. Like I go and talk to people who have information that I don't have. They don't usually come and push me that information, but when I go and say, hi, how are you? Is there anything cool that you could tell me today? I tend to get information from that way. There's all sorts of systems that we imagine that are useful, like Jira, but it is sometimes useful. Usually talking to people is much more useful. I can ask people, like end users, real end users, to join me so that I can see things from there. So usually it's more around talking. But like, do I do retrospectives? When I get told about a problem, I look at that, like how could we avoid that? But most of the retrospectives that I personally do are like reflections on what have I learned and how could I learn more? And where are my biases? Where am I overconfident and how could I test if that's the right way of doing things after all? Like for example, this whole mob programming thing, I was sure it's a bad idea. Wasting 10 people's time, like why would I do that? And because I was so convinced, I knew that I had to try it. And after I had tried it for 1.5 years in my previous place of work, I knew it's the best idea that I was about to discard. And this is a very regular way for me to do things. Like sometimes you test deeply, sometimes you don't do that and see what kind of feedback you get. So you actively seek for the feedback. It usually doesn't arrive to you like readily. At least that's been my experience. Do you have better ways of finding it?
No, I was just asking, how do you do it?
I do it by talking to people. Like for example, 2 days ago I wanted to find somebody who knows how we could test our new firewall rules. And I went to a demo, and I saw somebody from IT helping that demo to be organized. And I asked, does he know who is the best expert on that? And he didn't know, but he gave me another name. I went and talked to that person. Then I get another name, and then I went still to one other person and asked, I still got the same name. So then I thought that this is the person I want to talk to. And 3 o'clock today, we have a meeting to review the firewall rules. So that's how you get feedback. You talk to people. All right. I guess it's time to let you go and talk to each other or whatever you're doing in these sessions. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, that's